Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I also wanted to ask some things about this very concerning LIBOR issue. As we sit here today, do we know whether Citibank, Bank of America, JP Morgan, which participate in the LIBOR process like Barclays, did or did not similarly manipulate LIBOR?
We don't know that, but I think that's a question you need to refer to the enforcement agencies, and I suspect you're going to find that because this is still a confidential investigation, they won't be in a position to answer that question until the remaining investigation is brought to its natural conclusion. So I don't.
So we don't know that as we sit here today.
Well, I can only tell you what I know, and I don't know that. I don't know what they know. And the reason I don't is because, as you would expect, they have very careful protections around their investigations to preserve confidentiality.
When did you first know about this LIBOR issue and manipulation?
Well, as I said, in roughly the spring of '08.
So it's spring of '08.
Right.
So we're now over 4 years later, and we haven't answered that question.
No, I don't think that's quite right in the sense that, again, what we did at a very early stage in this process is bring this to the attention of the highest levels of the relevant agencies with authority to prevent manipulation and abuse, and
we brought it to the highest levels, but we haven't gotten to the bottom of it 4.5 years later.
Well, no, I don't.
Doesn't that unequivocally suggest somebody dropped the ball?
Well, I don't think you should look at it this way, but the CFTC at that same time started this investigation, ultimately involved the SEC and the Justice Department in it, and it is true it took 4 years for them to find the evidence they disclosed in the settlement. I don't know that that's that surprising if you look at what's typical in financial cases like this. Again, if you look at across history of these things take a lot of time. You have to do them very carefully.
You think it's reasonable to take 4.5 years, and we don't know as we sit here today whether Citi, Bank of America, or JP Morgan were involved in this activity?
I think you have to address that to them. But I think that, again, what they did, and to their credit, they started very early like we did in trying to make sure that they were examining carefully what there was any, not just risk of this behavior, but it was actually happening in that context. And they deserve enormous credit for doing that.
As the prudential regulator through the New York Fed of these three institutions, did you and the New York Fed look into the issue directly?
I believe that we did the necessary and appropriate things, as I said, in bringing this to the attention, not just to the Fed and the SEC and the CFTC, which is a very important thing to do at that early time, but also to the attention of the British. And remember, these concerns
Can I just follow up on the question? You don't think this issue with regard to those three institutions potentially impacted their safety and soundness?
I thought this was...
New York Fed was the primary regulator of that.
I thought this was a very important issue, not just for our financial system, but for the global financial system, which is why we did what we did. And again, I think that...
And do you think it directly potentially went to the safety and soundness of those three institutions?
I don't know, but I'm not sure that I needed to know that because I thought the concerns themselves were sufficiently troubling to justify a very substantial response.
Given what we all now agree is very troubling information about LIBOR, why was it allowed to be essentially the repayment metric for TARP?
Well, what you're referring to, I believe, is that in a series of specific programs that the Fed and the Treasury undertook in the financial crisis, we, like many investors, used LIBOR as a reference rate. In many ways, we were in the position of investors around the world, which is we had to make use of the best available index at that time. Now, you're raising the concern that were we disadvantaged by that? We don't know whether we were or not, but we're looking very carefully at that question. And we'll obviously be in a position to brief you on that once we've looked at it carefully enough.
When LIBOR was used in those contracts, you and others had knowledge of the fundamental systemic concerns about its validity, right? So why was it used in those contracts? Surely there were some other alternatives, and surely the federal government was calling the shots about the repayment metric.
No, you're right. We the Fed and the Treasury at that point had needed to choose what rate to reference, and we made a judgment at that time what was the best rate at that time. And it is true that at that same broad time frame, we knew this rate was vulnerable to the type of practice we face. But what we don't know is whether we were disadvantaged by that choice. Again, it's not clear at this stage, although this is really a question you should talk to the SEC and the CFTC about. We don't know at this point what impact that behavior had, the rate up or down for investors or borrowers. As one of your colleagues said earlier, it's possible that people who borrowed money were advantaged by this. It's possible people who lent money were disadvantaged, but we don't really know to the extent that happened.
It's certainly easy to imagine, let me put it this way, that mega banks that borrowed money were advantaged by manipulation of LIBOR that artificially pushed it down, correct?
It's possible, but again, if
that happened, the taxpayer was disadvantaged.
But I think if you read carefully the SEC settlement documents, you'll find that the attempted behavior went in both directions. So what you don't now know is what impact that had on the rate itself or the direction of the impact. But again, that is a very important issue, and it's an issue which those agencies and the other agencies that are part of the council are going to examine very carefully, and of course it's going to be a matter of litigation as well.
But you knew when using LIBOR that it was manipulated, so there was that potential, so why did we use it?
No, that's not quite accurate what you said. What we knew is that the way the rate was designed, as I said, and this was fully in the public domain, that the rate was designed where banks, mostly foreign banks, were presented estimates of what they might pay to borrow across these different currencies. And therefore, as you might expect, any rate that's an average of estimates, there's some risk in that context. And it was just that risk that caused us to push for broader reforms and make sure we brief the enforcement agencies. But
beyond that, you knew of reports of manipulation.
No, we knew of reports of underreporting at that context, misreporting at that context. But again, what we did was, in terms of choosing a reference rate, which is we do what investors around the world did, which is we had to make a choice among alternatives, and that was the best alternative available at the time. And you can't say now with confidence that that choice in any way disadvantaged the American taxpayer. I think it's quite unlikely, but we're going to take a careful look at that.
Well, again, let me just wrap up because I'm over time. Seems to me that Treasury and the Fed and the New York Fed knew of basic problems with LIBOR, knew of charges of manipulation that underreported and pushed down the rate, and then the Treasury adopts that very metric for TARP repayment. Now, it's very clear that that raises the huge potential of advantaging those mega banks and disadvantaging the taxpayer.
Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.